You know, I'm gonna be honest with you. I expected to just be angry when I read today's BNR update and for there just to be no changes in a highly phoned in article. But we actually got some changes, and Undercity Informer is banned. That's great, but I want to go into a lot of detail about kind of what I am expecting next. So here we go. Buckle up. It's going to be a long one. Hello folks, Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU here for another Legacy video, and today's video is very much a theory video. We're going to be talking about bans and what I am expecting next from the format. In case you haven't already seen, in the May 18th BNR update, we saw a lot of changes across multiple formats. Corey Steelcutter banned in Pioneer, Modern sees Flage and Lotus Field banned, but Violent Outburst and Umezawa's Jitte unbanned. And Jitte has never been Modern legal, so that's kind of exciting. Legacy Undercity Informer is banned. Yay! Yay! More on that in a minute. And then Bonder's Ornament is unbanned in Pauper, and an Alchemy Sewerveillance Cam is banned. I'm going to spend the rest of this video focusing on Legacy and Undercity Informer in particular, as I have a lot to say. And I think I want to kind of dig in and do another critical reading of these BNR updates, as people have enjoyed them a lot in the past. Let me shout out my sponsors first so that I don't have to interrupt the flow of the video moving forward. If you need any cards for the new metagame, please consider getting them from my sponsor, TOAMagic.com, and use promo code ThrabenU when you do to save a little bit on your order. These folks are great, and you can support me by supporting them. And this video is also sponsored by Moxfield.com. If you want to see all of the decks that I am going to be designing for the post-ban metagame, they are going to be live on Moxfield prior to going live for all of the videos. And I have over 1,000 deck lists on here, so that should be the strongest possible cosign I could give to using this website. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start getting into the text here. So here we go. Overall, Legacy looks pretty good. I would largely agree with that statement. I have been having a lot of fun playing Legacy recently, and the success of videos, including a handful of variety of NickFit, probably supports the fact that Legacy is pretty good. We're seeing new cards hit the format. That's true, with Flow State being one of the biggest ones, although there's other fringe players from Secrets of Strixhaven as well. And different decks are taking turns winning each week. That is maybe slightly more contentious, but I'm going to err on the side of agreeing with that. We have seen a handful of things sitting at the top for quite a while, with Dimir Tempo being the best example of that. But there has been some ebbing and flowing of decks, like, where exactly is Show and Tell on any given week. That one has fluctuated a lot over maybe about the past 2 months. And Tron is kind of like catapulting up to center stage right now, so I think I'm going to just generally agree with that. That doesn't mean that things can't be improved, however. Now, that's where I strongly agree with this article. Despite the fact that Legacy is relatively fun and may be relatively healthy, I think there is room for improvement. A lot of what's shifted in Legacy over the last year is a direct result of games decompressing and the ban list working as a tool to empower what Legacy players love about the format. If we think back to Dimir Reanimator specifically threatening turn 1 Entomb, turn 2 Reanimate, Legacy has certainly decompressed from that. The current Legacy format right now, there was a lot of pressure on the format from Oops, which is leaving with this announcement. More on that later. The current Tron deck has the possibility of making a lot of mana very quickly. There's some powerful Storm decks kind of hanging around the fringes of maybe about the top 10 of the format. But I would say that on average we are playing longer, more interesting Legacy games right now, especially as people are expecting to play longer games with these Flow State decks. And then the article starts talking about the injection of power that happened to Legacy with Modern Horizons 3. with Oops being the biggest gainer there, as its mana got significantly better with the next set of MDFCs. The next entire paragraph here is just a summary of Oops All Spells. We've seen that before in these articles. For a lot of its lifetime in Legacy, the deck was an affectionate demonstration of what was possible with Magic's game engine. No, I would say that this has been the most hated deck in Legacy for years at this point. The original creation of the deck was cool, and seeing that being, pushed with the MDFCs, there was real innovation there, and that was quite cool. I don't think affectionate and Oops All Spells belong anywhere close together. The deck is pretty universally hated. And a lot of times, even you'll hear the pilots say, like, yeah, this deck is kind of a sack of shit, but it's good, so I'm going to play it. It's extremely novel that something like this can exist, after all. The novelty wears off very quickly whenever the deck is strong enough to be a regular contender in the format. Yes, we, as the Eternal Glory podcast, have been talking about that for multiple BNR cycles, and how we would like this deck just absolutely yeeted from the format and to never play against it again. If we go back to the last BNR update, Oops's win rate was very, very good then. And until very recently, very, very recently, Oops has been like a top 3 player in the Legacy format, and has been quite good for a very long time at this point. And I want to talk about data on things like win rates in just a second. I'm going to keep going here. Over the past couple of years, the deck's presence in the metagame has ebbed and flowed, but hasn't ever dipped below the most popular half dozen or so decks. And usually it has been within about the top 3. In a lot of ways, this is an inherently problematic of a combo deck. Just thinking about what they thought was acceptable with Dimir Reanimator as a point of comparison should put that statement into perspective. But Oops All Spells being an extremely repetitive one-card combo deck is problematic. Yes, hard agree with that statement. It is not fun and engaging Magic the Gathering. We've been hesitant to act against the deck in the past because it largely didn't put up a concerning win rate. It did, and we have plenty of historical data showing that. Feel free to listen to our previous BNR updates on the Eternal Glory podcast if you want those historic numbers. We went into them, and at the time of the previous BNR updates, Oops was doing very, very, very well. Notice I am using past tense stuff here. More on that in just a second. So we've been hesitant to act against the deck in the past because it largely didn't put up a concerning win rate. So moving on past that. This signaled to us one of 2 possibilities. It could be that it's a deck that people like to play, although they're losing. I don't think they were losing. I think they were winning, and I think they were winning incredibly quickly. And I think a lot of people who were drawn to Oops All Spells were trying to make money by grinding leagues as quickly as possible by playing a deck that could very consistently send their combo on turn 1 or turn 2. If you are just trying to brute force accumulate treasure chests or play points or sell your treasure chests, whatever it is exactly that you are trying to do, it is hard to pick a better deck than Oops All Spells. It is relatively straightforward to pilot, especially in Game 1 scenarios. There are a lot of decks that are fully just dead to it and can barely interact with it, and it was very, very good at beating the hate that was targeted against it, as things like Memory's Journey often made it so that typical graveyard hate didn't work, and you were largely forced to play 4 Leyline of the Voids in Legacy to have a fighting chance against this deck. This is less true for blue decks that have their free counterspells, but if you weren't playing a blue deck, it was very, very hard to keep up with this deck. And the next paragraph goes to kind of a nostalgic view of Legacy, which is something I kind of heard repeated a lot back in the Star City Open days. One of Legacy's greatest strengths is that it rewards long-term fandom and mastery. It's a format brimming with people who have played with their cards for over a decade and have spent even longer than that collecting some of them. For anyone who's newer to the format, it can be extremely daunting to take those first steps towards becoming a regular Legacy player. This is also something that we hope prospective Legacy players have access to. there should be budget decks in Legacy, and Oops All Spells was a very powerful budget deck. There was for a very long time this idea that if you buy into a Legacy deck, you are buying a deck for life. That it is less expensive to actually play something like Legacy in comparison to something like Standard, because you make your one-time purchase of your Legacy deck, and then you basically maybe update it with a card or two every few sets, and that was that. And for a very long time, that was true. And when we reached the Fire Design era, and especially like the Modern Horizons sets, Legacy started changing a lot more. And this idea of playing with the same cards for over a decade is significantly less true in Legacy than it used to be. It is certainly still true that you can play a strategy like Delver for a very long time, but if you compare the Death and Taxes deck of a decade ago to the Death and Taxes deck now, there's very little overlap between the old versions of the deck and the new versions of the deck. I think that there are plenty of budget decks in Legacy that are perfectly fine and playable, and you can take to an FNM style event and have fun with, that are healthier for the format as a whole than something like Oops All Spells. So I don't like the idea that was presented in the previous BNR update of Oops being preserved despite its incredibly unhealthy play patterns to be a deck that is reasonably budget friendly. Unfortunately, the last few months have seen Oops All Spells make a largely unhealthy impact on the format, with its win rate consistently rising over the last few months. The degree to which the deck can win on turn 1 is frustrating. Oh yeah, certainly. And feeds some of the worst stereotypes about games in eternal formats feeling decided before one person gets to play. While the deck is answerable and there are some strategies that are very good at countering it, it's ultimately throttling what decks are reasonable to play in Legacy. And I really agree with that final thing here. It's ultimately throttling what decks are reasonable to play in Legacy. An absolutely massive number of the decks that are showcased on this channel just have no game versus Oops, especially in Game 1. I tend to feature interesting non-blue decks in particular on this channel, and they just always died to Oops All Spells, and it led to me just hating getting paired against that deck. Often you would draw your targeted hate in the post-sideboard games, and it just was not enough to win. I recently remember, I think, interacting with Oops's graveyard twice, taking them off of enough things to have a valid dread return because they did not have enough creatures, and they just Dark Ritual, played another spy from hand, and won anyway. And that's kind of the experience of playing against Oops All Spells. So many decks just could not keep up with it. Now, I do want to make sure that I am being fair in terms of things like data. And I want to call this out here in particular, with its win rate consistently rising over the last few months. I think for a very long time, Oops was getting better and better and better and better, and I've talked about it being a top 3 deck in the format relatively consistently. However, in the short term, I think Oops was actually on a natural decline as other things started to become stronger and more popular within the format. So this chart right here is from MetaMage on Twitter/X, and this looks at MTGO Top 32 and MTG Melee results from April 1st to May 10th. And again, I am recording this on the 18th. And when we look at Oops All Spells' current win rate within this data set, it was barely winning over 50% of its games. I hate Oops All Spells with a passion. I do not want that archetype to exist at all within Legacy. I do not believe that it is fun to play with or against. I know that my viewers do not enjoy watching it or having me play it. And quite frankly, I think the gameplay patterns are rancid. However, If we are going by the numbers and the data, if we take this as a reasonably large data set, and this is, I think that's 278 matches, that's a decent sized data set, it is not doing well overall. It is positive versus Show and Tell, extremely negative versus Dimir Tempo, which is the most popular deck in the format, even versus Mystic Forge combo, positive versus Energy, positive versus Izzet Delver, positive versus Blue Artifacts, and negative versus some other stuff here. Although the sample size on some of these are incredibly small when we start getting down here. So don't look at that and go, oh, Death and Taxes bullies Oops All Spells. So what I see when I look at this is a deck that is doing very, very well versus most of the stuff at the top of the metagame that is just simply not Dimir Tempo. And when I think back to larger data sets from things like Eternal Weekend, I remember Oops All Spells just absolutely dumpstering a lot of the lower performing decks in the format. Now, Wizards of the Coast presumably has access to more data and better data than we have. I am not sure that the current short-term data supports banning Oops All Spells, or rather a card from Oops All Spells. Looking at tournament results here, maybe the deck was fine. It is miserable to play against. I hate getting paired against it. I hate how much pressure it puts on the format during deck construction. I hate how much pressure it puts on sideboarding. By the numbers, perhaps this ban was not justified right now. It certainly, unquestionably, was justified in probably the last 2 BNR cycles, and I have been advocating very, very strongly for that. But right now, we have other things that are on the rise that are pushing Oops All Spells down. And Oops has fallen from being about a top 3 deck to being about a top 6 deck. Whether you look at a 7-day, a 14-day, or a 30-day result on a site like MTG Goldfish, it falls in 6th place at all 3 after holding 3rd place pretty strong for quite some time. So the deck, based on what I can see, was actually on a decline. So, while I am very, very happy with this change, and I think this is a great change for Legacy, the data that I can see does not indicate that this deck's win rate is currently going up. I know that this deck's win rate has gone up in the past. I don't know that right now is the strongest point that Oops All Spells ever has been when it is getting hit by this ban. So there is me being fair to this deck. So getting back to our article now, according to Wizards, its win rate consistently kept rising over the last few months. Let's kind of assume that that is true based on the data that they have. They may have, tons and tons and tons of data from leagues that we simply do not have access to. They previously weren't willing to act on this deck, and maybe it is because they got clowned on social media very, very hard for some of the statements that they made surrounding this deck, or maybe it is because this deck has improved and we just can't see that data. But something has caused them to act, and then the question is, what do we do? And they have ultimately banned Undercity Informer while keeping Spy legal. The WotC intent here is to preserve the existence of the deck and depower it. They don't want people to consistently be playing against this deck like they are right now. Having the deck survive and be something that, you play against once every 20 leagues as opposed to once a league, that's a very, very different thing. And they are shooting for keeping this deck at a reasonable power level so that the people who really, really like this style of deck can continue to play it, while reducing the footprint the deck has in the metagame by the virtue of it being far less consistent. And this is the last chunk of the article I'm going to read before I kind of split this into a new section. That said, we're going to continue to monitor the deck as it evolves from here and won't hesitate to take further action against it as the future necessitates. So why is this statement here? I think this statement is here because the Oops community has known that it has been up to some shit for quite some time, and they already have versions of the deck that exist for different ban scenarios. They've been prepared for this for quite some time. Undercity Informer is perhaps the first thing to go from this archetype. This is the one that costs less mana and can be split across 2 turns. Balustrade Spy can also be interacted with via some things like stifle effects that get rid of its trigger. So if they were going to cut one of the 2, I do think that they probably picked the correct one. This is cast off of a Dark Ritual and a land alone, whereas this one isn't. However, there are just things that you can do to tutor for your spy, and Lively Dirge is an example of that. You can probably just take your 4 Undercity Informers that were just banned and throw in 4 Lively Dirges into your deck and change very few other things about your deck. So for a total of 5 mana, you can search your library for a card, one of your spies, put it into your graveyard, and shuffle, and then return up to 2 creature cards with total mana value 4 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this makes the Oops All Spells combo deck, on average, cost more mana to execute. But it does not actually change whether or not this deck can exist. It just makes it so that you need 1 more total mana in order to execute your combo. And Oops All Spells is basically a deck that is almost entirely mana. So I am not sure how much worse this deck is going to be. I think the answer is it is worse, but I think that this strategy still totally exists. And I think the folks at Wizards here have done enough minimal homework to realize, like, we have printed so many tutors over the years that, like, stuff like this is very, very possible. So I am glad to hear that they are going to continue to monitor this deck. On the Eternal Glory podcast, we have advocated for taking out both Spy and Informer at the same time and not doing the half measures that can leave this deck alive. We just all want this deck completely gone from the format and never play against it again. That is not what Wizards is trying to do here. They are trying to see if they can depower this without necessarily totally killing the deck. And we will kind of see how things shake out here. So in terms of this section of the article, I think I'm going to give it a thumbs up. I was incredibly critical of the previous BNR article that they wrote because I thought that everything was just wrong that was in it. And there were very few statements that I just fully agreed with in the previous BNR article. I think the first half of this article here has at least gotten a lot of stuff right. Based on some of the publicly available data, I am not sure if Oops was actually continuing to increase in play rate in the very, very short term. I've sometimes suspected that these BNR updates are written quite a while in advance and then they sit kind of untouched. So it may be that all of those statements were true at the time that they were written, and then maybe things have changed in the short term since it was written. But overall, I am happy with this change. I think this change makes Legacy better. I think this does accomplish their goal of depowering Oops, and over the next couple of weeks, we will see whether or not that is actually going to be enough. We do have another BNR window in about a month and a half, so if the answer is no, this deck is still around and is still problematic, we can hopefully yeet the other half of Oops All Spells into the garbage can and move on with our lives. Okay, so now I want to talk about the second half of the article, which addresses all of the other stuff going on in Legacy. And while I think the first half of the article was very good, I think a good portion of this next half was kind of written with like quick throwaway thoughts. And I'm not sure how much some of the statements actually hold up all that well. Watching the rest of the Legacy metagame develop is a treat. We've seen Dimir Tempo's metagame share come down over the last couple of months. Izzet decks are using Flow State from Secrets of Strixhaven to great effect, and we're seeing the white decks cement a foothold in the metagame. There is one deck that is worth calling out, and that is going to be the Tron deck. I suspect that these were written as throwaway statements that were not actually researched all that well. because I don't think most of the stuff here is actually true. So first, we've seen Dimir Tempo's metagame share come down over the last couple of months. I believe that Dimir Tempo remains the top played deck in the format on every single possible MTG Goldfish view in the last 365 days. It has very consistently held the top seat of the format, with numbers varying between about 10 to 12% of the format, depending on what given week we are in. But it has very consistently been the top thing going on in the format. And, kind of thinking back to the last couple years of Legacy, Dimir has just kind of been the best color pairing, with the Dimir Reanimator deck going on a generational run, as Wizards of the Coast did not take action or enough action on that deck. But generally speaking, Thoughtseize and Force of Will as a generic set of tools has been one of the best things to do in Legacy for a very, very long time now. So by the numbers, how has Dimir Tempo done? In the last 365 days, it is 10.2% of the format. In the last 90 days, it was 12.8. In the last 30 days, 12.6. In the last 14, 10.3. In the last 7, 9.4. So Dimir Tempo has been the most played deck in the format for quite some time. If we compare like the 365 to the 7-day, its play rate is absolutely going down. And I think part of that is because people are exploring these Izzet tempo decks right now, largely because of Flow State from Secrets of Strixhaven. However, I think we are going to see Dimir's play rate continue to go up. And that's because the Izzet decks are not doing well. So let's go back to this screenshot one more time. So here is Dimir Tempo with about a 53.5% win rate, whereas Izzet Delver is on a 43% win rate, 10% lower than Dimir Tempo. While it has a very good matchup versus Sneak and Show, as it can close the game very quickly with its burn spells, it is not doing well with anything else that is played at a reasonable percentage, and only has 2 positive matchups on this entire chart here. Izzet Delver is getting its teeth kicked in, despite the fact that it is just everywhere as people are trying out these flow state versions of the deck. So when we come back here, Izzet decks are using flow state from Secrets of Strixhaven to great effect. I would say it is true that Izzet decks are using flow state, but I would say it is false that they are using it to great effect. That deck is not good right now. And I would say it's actually Dimir Tempo that is using flow state to good effect, as it is frequently a 4 of in that deck, although that is not always true. And we're seeing the white decks cement a foothold in this metagame. Why do we always feel the need to mention the white decks and say that they're doing fine? 'Cause they're not. With the exception of Energy, if you want to count that as a full-on white deck, the decks that are playing white in Legacy are not doing particularly well either. With the exception of the Energy deck, there is no point in the last year worth of data where, according to MTG Goldfish, where another white deck has been in the top 10 decks in Legacy. So this idea that like fair decks like Death and Taxes and Maverick that are just casting their Erodes and Swords to Plowshares are doing well is just not the case. 7, 14, 30, 90, 365, in none of those windows is a Swords to Plowshares deck other than Energy in the top 10. That is not to say that there are no reasons to play those decks, and we have seen some blue-white Felia, blue-white Riddler, blue-white flow state stuff kind of floating around the edges of the format, but it has not been, or rather they have not been major players. They have just been things that you can reasonably be doing in Legacy. And the next thing this article does is talk about Tron. And if you are not super dialed into Legacy, especially in about the last 2 weeks, this is something that you might have missed happening. And when I say Tron, I do actually mean Tron. I don't just mean Planar Nexus and Urza's Tower alone. I mean all of these together in a build that normally has 4 copies of Candelabra of Tawnos. This is a very, very successful and relatively fast big mana deck. They have the ability to go quickly with Grim Monolith like we had seen before, but with all of these various Urza lands now, Candelabra means that you can very consistently get to things like Ugin, and that you can really go wild with Karn and or the One Ring, and Kozilek's Command is still just Kozilek's Command. So, we've seen the newest shape of Colorless Tron surge up the standings of both metagame share and win rate. The deck hasn't displayed the longevity necessary for the team to feel we need to step in, and this is something that I do agree with. But if it maintains its win rate and growth of metagame share much further, we're going to explore what options we have to keep Legacy healthy. And this is where I'm going to go to a different data set that I haven't used yet. Because when we look at this data set for the Mystic Forge deck, I don't feel like you get the whole story. I feel like you get a look at a deck that is very, very strong. But for example, Energy has a higher overall win rate than this deck by a pretty significant margin. So it looks like this is pretty even versus the stuff at the top of the format, and positive versus some of the things that people are frequently playing. In fact, very positive versus those things. But you can see a decent amount of red in this graph still. So we're now going to go to a data set from Crucible of Words that looks at how the decks are doing in Legacy challenges in particular. And the thing that I want to draw your attention to is this overrepresentation column. So basically, the higher this number is above 1, the better that deck performs relative to the number of players who are playing it. So if a deck has a 1.00 for its representation, then we would expect that it kind of does, by the numbers, how you would expect it to do. And if that number starts going up and up and up, then it is winning more and top 8ing more than you might expect based on the number of players who are submitting it. And going back to Izzet Delver as an example, Izzet Delver has a 5% share of the metagame and is just getting absolutely bodied. You see this red color here representing the fact that this deck is not performing well. And you can see some of the top decks in the format have a positive overrepresentation, which probably means that they are good. Going back to Oops All Spells for a moment here, when we look at the Legacy challenges in particular and we exclude the MTG Melee data, we can see that Oops All Spells is winning about 12% of the events and has the third most number of top 8s total. So by this data set, perhaps Oops All Spells is doing quite well. But the thing that is interesting here is that this Karn Ring deck, as they are calling it on this sheet, is 3.5% of the metagame, but has 54 top 8s and an overrepresentation value of 2.61. And if you just look at all of these other values, even if you know nothing about the statistics involved here, it is clear like, oh, that deck is doing very well. And note that this newer breakthrough version of the deck is relatively recent. So this deck is very, very strong. And something that we on the Eternal Glory podcast have been saying for about the past year now. I think we started saying this in maybe fall of last year. We have started saying that we don't think that the One Ring will be legal in Legacy a year from now, because we keep seeing these builds of One Ring decks coming together, taking over the metagame for a while, and then they kind of ebb out. And we have seen One Ring decks just absolutely overperform at a couple of different Eternal Weekend events now. And now we have seen people kind of crack a build that has been theoretically possible for a while, but the deck building has finally come together. Someone iterated and just figured out, hey, 4 Candelabra is kind of crazy. And now it is picking up steam. This is a very recent thing to Legacy, and I don't think that I would have acted on it in this particular B&R update, but this is something that I have my eye on. And this is a deck where if it keeps up the numbers that it is currently doing, it would not surprise me if we lose the One Ring from this deck in the B&R update at the end of June. My guess is that Tron is probably a top 2 or top 3 deck in the Legacy format right now. Again, this exact build is relatively new, so we're still getting a feel for how it is going to perform longer term, and it may be that with Oops leaving the format and some pressure being taken off of sideboards, that people can have a chance to dedicate more cards at this deck. And, we can see, how does this deck fare if people are playing Sony Silences and Null Rods, and now the Candelabras don't work? There may be some natural metagame movement here that happens to try and keep this deck in check. Previous Legacy formats have not been able to keep decks that look like this in check. And for example, we had to eject Vexing Bauble from the format because these decks being just allowed to resolve their spells was just fully unacceptable. And we'll see how this shakes out. So overall, I think thumbs up to the Oops All Spell section. Overall, I think kind of shaky sideways thumb to thumbs down on the tail end of the article. I will say I am happy that they mentioned Tron at all. This is a relatively recent thing that has really been picking up in Steam. And based on the overall quality of these articles previously, this is something that I would have expected to slip through the cracks and them to not have noticed yet. It may be that overall, the data that they are looking at is just egregious, and they're like, oh, we've got to mention this now. We've got to get ahead of this one. So either they did their research or the alarm bells are going off and they're like, it's fine. The whole will hold for another month. So you might get to play with your Broken Tron stuff for a little while longer. Maybe, rent that deck, try it out in a league if you're curious about how this one is going to play out in practice. I am going to be honest. I expected most of this article today to be about the card flow state. The parallels to the already banned expressive iteration are so incredibly clear that I thought we were going to get we're keeping an eye on flow state, but we're not ready to take any action yet sort of article today. That is fully what I was expecting. And flow state only got a passing mention. This reminds me of the previous B&R article where I expected a rich article talking about Tamiyo, and I think Tamiyo was left out of the article completely. Flow state has been out for less than a month at this point. It is very clearly changing the Legacy format, but some of the decks that are playing flow state actually aren't doing well, with the Is It Tempo deck being the best example of that. So if people are adopting flow state and it's not particularly strong, then is that a card that we actually need to address at this exact moment? The Dimir Tempo decks are just gassed full of cards that are incredibly strong. Tamiyos and Barogoyfs and Flow States and Thoughtseizes and Force of Wills and Dazes. The overall card quality in that deck is extremely high. And I'm probably of the opinion that Dimir needs to be taken down a peg again. The play patterns surrounding Tamiyo are not particularly great, but, way better than the play patterns around something like Oops All Spells. I don't love the fact that a 1-mana creature, when drawn on turn 15, is a, oh shit, like I gotta answer that now or I'm gonna lose to that card sort of situation. I don't love how easy it is to protect with Brainstorm. I don't love that Brainstorm can flip it and turn it into a Planeswalker so quickly. I don't love the fact that a 1-mana Planeswalker's ultimate can just kind of win the game on its own, effectively speaking. I think there's a lot to dislike about Tamiyo. And it would not surprise me if by the time we get to June, we have enough data to act on something like Tamiyo or Flow State. If you listen to our BNR updates or you go back and listen to some of these previous videos that I have recorded over the last couple of BNR cycles, I think Tamiyo is problematic for a lot of different reasons. And when we go back to the statement in this article that is like, Legacy is pretty good, but it can be improved, I think that's kind of where Tamiyo currently falls in my mind. It's something that I would like to see go, but if it sticks around for a little while longer, so be it. I am largely having fun playing current Legacy. I think since the recent episode of the Eternal Glory podcast would overlap so much with what I want to say in this section, I'm just going to refer you to that episode if you want some more long-form thoughts on Flow State and Tamiyo, and I think I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping this one up. Overall, I am more excited to play Legacy than I was this morning. And that's great. I expected no changes and to kind of keep going on, but hopefully we see a little bit less oops in the leagues moving forward. The disastrous result of this could actually be that people start immediately playing more oops as they try Lively Dirge out to see whether or not the deck is still viable, and I am hoping that does not happen in the short term, as I will, old man, yell at clouds at Wizards of the Coast if this deck is still just as viable as it was earlier this morning. That said, I am happy that we have another BNR update not too far ahead. I believe it is June 30th is the next window for a BNR update. So if things with oops are still a little unacceptable, or if some of this Tamiyo flow state stuff ends up being too good and Dimir just kind of remains cemented at the top of the format with nothing able to shake it from its spot, maybe we can do some more spot adjustments then. We did see some modern unbannings in this one, so maybe we could see some legacy unbannings as well. Something they said in a previous article was that they want unbannings to kind of be their own thing by legacy standards. So if they believe that legacy is stable, we might see some trial unbannings, as we are seeing in formats like Pauper, and maybe we can bring back some of those old favorites. You wouldn't care if I mind twisted people, right? That would be fun. That would be fun for people named Phil. All right, let's go ahead and call it there. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any thoughts, please throw them down in the comments below. Folks, I hope you have a great rest of the day. I will begin recording post-ban content immediately. YouTube members will probably have their first post-ban video available later today. And everyone else should have access to post-ban content starting on Monday, May 25th. But you've got some really good content coming in the next couple of days. I'm really looking forward to Thursday's video, which is a Nick Fit variant that is even spicier than the stuff I've already shown you on this channel. All right. Have a great day, folks. See ya.